Hey, it's Matthew again. Today's compilation features the dumbest climbers who thought they could climb Everest. From a pair who failed to properly tighten a boot, causing them to be ripped from the fixed line, to a woman's refusal to turn back despite her guide's warning about a dangerous traffic jam in the death zone. It was May 16, 2014, at the Hillary Step on Mount Everest, roughly 28,900 feet above sea level. Camp 4 departures had been delayed overnight, compressing climbers into a narrow summit window. Wind was moderate, visibility was clear, and the fixed lines were already crowded. The mountain was not hostile that morning. It was simply unforgiving of small mistakes. Miguel Arroyo was 39, a warehouse supervisor from Puebla, Mexico, accustomed to long shifts and physical work. He trained hard, trusted his strength, and believed endurance could bridge gaps in experience. His expedition was budget-constrained, relying on rented equipment, secured days before the climb. New high-altitude boots were fitted quickly, adequate on paper, unfamiliar in reality. Kenji Sato was 52, a Japanese hobby climber who approached Everest methodically. He kept detailed journals, followed checklists, and moved deliberately on fixed lines. Kenji had summited lower peaks over decades and accepted slow progress as safety. He was clipped directly behind Miguel that day, maintaining minimal spacing to keep the line moving. The Hillary Step had become a choke point as climbers queued to ascend and descend. Miguel felt the delay, cutting into his turnaround margin, and rushed final adjustments. He tightened one boot fully. The other was left marginal, snug enough to walk, but not locked for lateral loading. No one stopped him. Time pressure overruled rechecking. As the line inched forward, Miguel stepped high onto a rock edge, glazed with old ice. The move required sideways pressure. His loose boot twisted. The ankle snapped outward with a crack heard by climbers above and below. Miguel screamed and collapsed backward, slamming into the rope. Kenji was clipped close and was yanked forward instantly. Miguel flailed, loading the fixed line violently. The rope jerked. Kenji's carabiner rotated under shock, cross-loaded against the rock. The gate failed. Both men lost attachment simultaneously. They tumbled together down the south face, bodies striking rock steps in rapid succession. Helmets shattered. Packs tore free. Within seconds, they disappeared from view, falling hundreds of feet. Climbers above shouted and called on radios. No rescue was possible from that position. Later examination found Miguel suffered an open ankle fracture before the fall, followed by massive blunt force injuries incompatible with life. Kenji sustained immediate cervical spine transection on the first major impact. Rope fibers and carabiner deformation were consistent with extreme shock loading beyond design limits. The incident was logged as a fatal fall involving equipment misuse under congestion. The rental shop later revised boot-fitting policies and required extended testing before issuance. Kenji's journal was recovered from his pack, the final entry reading, "Check boots twice." Recovery was delayed by traffic and altitude, and both bodies were located days later below the route. Weather windows limited movement, and teams documented the scene before descent. The fixed line was replaced, and spacing rules were reiterated during subsequent summit pushes. The loss reinforced how congestion amplifies minor errors into shared consequences. Investigators noted no manufacturing defects in the rope or hardware. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and standard failure modes. Climbers behind were instructed to descend immediately. Operations resumed later with stricter turnaround enforcement and mandatory gear checks at Camp 4. Guides briefed clients on spacing, communication, and rechecking boots at every stop. The summit window closed soon after. The mountain remained unchanged, but the margin for error was shown to be thinner than schedules allowed. Both families were notified through their expedition operators, and personal effects were returned during the following season after recovery efforts concluded under clear documentation and chain of custody procedures observed strictly. It was May 17, 2016, and the pre-dawn cold at Camp 3 on the Lhotse face held at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp clung to a narrow shelf chopped into the ice at 23,500 feet. Tents anchored by screws driven into blue ice that creaked under thermal stress. Stacy Lusk was 44, from Scottsdale, Arizona, a real estate executive with a legitimate climbing resume. Denali, Aconcagua, multiple Himalayan trekking peaks. She had planned to climb Everest, but missed the permit deadline and lost her guiding slot. She took a discounted Lhotse position instead, accepted on paper, never intended to climb Lhotse. Her climbing Sherpa was Pemba Chotar, 33, with 7 Lhotse summits and 4 on Everest. Small in stature, but his endurance at altitude was something bigger climbers couldn't match. Throughout the expedition, Stacy kept asking detailed questions about the Everest route, where it split from Lhotse, how the ropes were set up above Camp 3, what the traverse across the yellow band looked like. Pemba figured she was just curious. Other Sherpas later called it reconnaissance. I'll be real, when I was putting this story together, the reconnaissance part caught me off guard. This wasn't impulsive. She spent weeks gathering intel on a route she was never supposed to be on. On summit push morning, team climbed above Camp 3 in the dark, at around 24,500 feet, where the Lhotse route continued straight, while the Everest route cut left toward the Geneva spur. Stacy unclipped from the Lhotse line and clipped onto the Everest traverse rope. Pemba called out right away. She waved him off and kept moving. He followed and told her straight. Her permit was for Lhotse. She had no oxygen cached on the Everest route. No Sherpa support above this point. She'd be arrested on descent. Stacy told him the permit system was a money grab, and she was already past the point of turning back. She called it a money grab. I need you to sit with that. The permit system exists because people die on this mountain every single year, and the woman calling it a scam is about to prove exactly why it exists. Pemba radioed base camp. Every response said the same thing: get her off the route. He blocked the fixed rope at the yellow band and laid out the math. Her oxygen was calculated for a Lhotse summit, not the extra hours Everest would take. Without supply cached above, she'd run out. Stacy pushed past him. Pemba refused to follow. He unclipped from the Everest rope and went back down to the Lhotse line. Stacy was alone on the Everest route, above 25,000 feet. She made it to around 26,200 feet on the Geneva spur before the oxygen math became undeniable. She turned around, but she'd been above 24,500 feet for hours longer than planned, exhausted, hypoxic, moving through terrain she'd never seen before. On the traverse back, she missed a clip-in point on an exposed section of rope. She tumbled several hundred feet, down the face before coming to rest against broken ice. A Sherpa team found her the next morning. Pemba Chotar was questioned by authorities for 2 days. His answers never changed. He warned her, blocked her, radioed for support, and refused to enable the decision. He was cleared, but other Sherpas said he was quieter after that season. 2 days of questioning for a man who did everything right. That part genuinely made me angry. He warned her, he blocked the rope, he called it in, and he still had to sit in a room and justify himself. It was May 19th, 2017. Everest's southeast ridge, above 26,000 feet, sat in early morning cold, below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with critically low oxygen. At that altitude, survival depended entirely on precise oxygen use and the ability to make decisions while the body and mind were already shutting down. Leopold Carver, 44, and Stuart Nolan, 42, arrived on Everest as inexperienced climbers from Flagstaff, Arizona. They didn't really build up to technical climbing or serious alpine experience. Instead, Everest was something they decided to try later in life, more out of restlessness and a kind of quiet one-upmanship than actual preparation or skill. That need to keep pace with each other followed them onto the mountain, and it started to shape their choices in a way that had less to do with conditions and more to do with pride and not wanting to fall behind. That kind of mindset doesn't mix well with Everest. They started their summit push from Camp 4 at 26,300 feet, late at night with their Sherpa guide, Mingma. Each of them carried 4 oxygen bottles, enough for a controlled ascent and descent if everything stayed within plan. But early on, Leopold made a small mistake he didn't catch. His oxygen was set higher than it should have been, pulling from his supply faster with every step. There was no alarm, no clear warning, just a quiet drain happening in the background while he kept moving through the cold and darkness, never realizing anything was off. By the time Mingma checked his system near the balcony, 1 full bottle had already been consumed. There was no warning sound, no visible malfunction, just a silent loss of margin in an environment where every minute of oxygen mattered. The setting was corrected, but the damage was already done. From that point on, their reserve was smaller than they believed. At around 27,800 feet, Stewart experienced a nosebleed and briefly removed his oxygen mask. The interruption lasted only a few minutes, but at that altitude, even short exposure without supplemental oxygen begins to affect cognitive function. Over the next hour, his movement became less precise. He misclipped a section of fixed rope, hesitated on simple transitions, and showed the early signs of oxygen deprivation affecting judgment and coordination. Despite these issues, they continued toward the south summit. When they arrived at 28,704 feet, their oxygen reserves were already significantly reduced. The weather still appeared stable, and the summit was within reach. Mingma presented the option to turn back, but both men chose to continue. That decision marked the point where control began to slip. They reached the summit briefly under clear conditions before beginning their descent. On the way down, the environment changed quickly. Wind increased, temperatures dropped further, and oxygen consumption rose as exertion intensified. Leopold's third oxygen bottle depleted faster than expected. By the time they moved below the south summit, both climbers were already operating on minimal reserves. At extreme altitude, exhaustion is not gradual in the way it is at sea level. It compresses, movement becomes inefficient, thinking slows, and small errors begin to stack. At approximately 27,800 feet, Leopold's final oxygen bottle ran empty. The change in him was immediate. Leopold's posture slumped, and he struggled to stay upright on the fixed line. Mingma clipped him in and tried to stabilize him, giving him emergency oxygen from his own reserve. Stewart moved in to help, but, in the confusion, briefly took off his mask again, cutting into his already low oxygen. Within minutes, both men were clearly fading, slow, confused, and no longer thinking or reacting normally at that altitude. Mingma radioed for urgent support from Camp 4, but response time at that altitude was slow, and terrain conditions made rapid ascent difficult. Two Sherpas began climbing immediately, but they were still far below the team. Help is always on the way, but rarely fast enough. As the emergency oxygen was cycled between them, the supply proved insufficient to stabilize both climbers at once. Leopold drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to remain upright without assistance. Stewart eventually sat down on the slope and stopped responding coherently. His breathing became shallow and uncoordinated. Within minutes, both men entered a state of severe hypoxia with no functional ability to move independently. When additional Sherpas arrived, both climbers were already unresponsive. Rescue efforts focused immediately on reoxygenation and stabilization, but the prolonged period without adequate oxygen at extreme altitude had already caused irreversible neurological damage. There was no meaningful recovery response. Neither Leopold Carver nor Stuart Nolan survived the descent from the southeast ridge. The expedition review identified oxygen mismanagement as the initiating failure. Leopold's early overconsumption reduced their safety margin without detection, while Stuart's intermittent oxygen loss accelerated cognitive decline during critical sections of the climb. The report also noted that a single guide managing two deteriorating clients at extreme altitude left no effective buffer once both climbers began to fail simultaneously. It was May 23, 2017. The upper mountain was clear, one of those rare summit windows that pulls every waiting team out of their tents at once. The south col was crowded. Fixed ropes above the balcony were moving slowly under the weight of traffic, and temperatures at the summit that morning were sitting around minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be in a line of people all quietly racing the same clock, that's the south col on a good weather day. Everyone up there knows the window. Everyone up there is counting. Kelso Prin had a different kind of count going. 34 years old, content creator, built his whole thing around firsts. First to broadcast live from extreme locations. First to put his audience inside moments nobody had streamed before. Everest was his largest production yet, and he had secured paid access from his audience to watch a live summit broadcast, his primary revenue event for the year. He had reached high altitude before on Aconcagua without serious incident, and I think that probably gave him more confidence than the situation actually warranted. He arrived with a custom rig rigged satellite broadcast pack that shared a battery system with his heated glove liners, a setup his own technician had flagged as a power management risk before departure. Kelso noted it and moved on. Someone had already seen it coming, so what was he thinking? Here's the thing about summit day on Everest. You're basically running a race where the finish line is also the halfway point. You push through the night, hit the top, and then you still have to get all the way back down before the mountain decides it's done cooperating. Every team on that col knew the drill. Kelso knew it too. He just had a live audience to keep happy on top of all that, and that's where things started getting complicated. The live stream kicked off at Camp 4 and ran straight through the ascent. The battery pack was drawing more power than anticipated. Lithium batteries lose significant efficiency below freezing, something that hadn't been properly accounted for at that altitude. The drain was happening the entire time, quietly, steadily, with every hour of broadcast. By the time Kelso reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, his heated glove liners had dropped to minimal function. He noticed his fingertips were numb. He kept moving. He didn't switch off the broadcast. People had paid for it, and he wasn't about to cut the feed with the summit still above him. I get the logic, but the mountain was already collecting on that decision, and he had no idea. He reached the summit and broadcast from the top for close to 20 minutes. By any measure, that's the moment the whole expedition was built around. What nobody watching could see was that his hands were already in serious trouble. The glove system had been effectively dead for hours. He turned around and started down, and that's when the full weight of it started to show. The descent required heavy Sherpa assistance because Kelso could not grip the fixed ropes properly. Not struggling, could not grip. He reached Camp 4 by early afternoon, and the expedition medic at base camp pushed hard for an immediate helicopter evacuation. Both hands were waxy, pale, hardening across all fingers. Kelso refused. He had announced a post-summit recovery series during the live stream, and he intended to film it from base camp. He wasn't going anywhere. And this, right here, is where the story stops being about equipment failure and turns into something else entirely. He spent 2 nights at Camp 4 before working his way down to base camp over the following days. 4 days after summiting, by the time he got there, both hands had visible tissue discoloration, skin beginning to blister. He was evacuated to a lower altitude medical facility, but not because he agreed to go. The expedition leader overrode his refusal and arranged transport. By the time he reached medical care, the infection had spread well beyond his hands. Surgical intervention was attempted. It wasn't enough. Kelso Prin died 9 days after standing on the summit of Everest. 9 days. He survived the climb, survived the descent, made it all the way back to base camp, and then died from something that was entirely preventable if he had just left when he was told to. The findings confirmed septic shock as cause of death, secondary to bilateral deep frostbite with critically delayed treatment. The report was blunt about it. Evacuation within 24 hours of descent would have significantly changed the outcome. I think about that a lot. 24 hours was all the margin there was between a bad outcome and a survivable one. Battery drain logs from the broadcast rig confirmed the power crossover failure. The glove system had been running well below effective output long before he reached the summit. The live stream footage was reviewed and the timeline reconstructed from it. The expedition's formal report noted that evacuation had been recommended and refused on 2 separate occasions before the leader stepped in. The case was closed as accidental death, delayed treatment listed as the determining factor. It was May 11, 2017. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. At Camp 2 in the western CWM, climbers rested in their tents at 21,000 feet, preparing for rotations to higher camps. Shelby Fairchild was 51 years old, a grandmother and part-time yoga instructor from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had recently become a grandmother and wanted to prove she was still capable of major physical achievements. She had paid significant money for a guided Everest expedition using inheritance funds. Her climbing experience included guided trips to Kilimanjaro and a failed attempt on Aconcagua, where she had turned back due to altitude sickness. She was fit for her age, but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and was determined to be the grandmother who summited Everest. Everest's extreme altitude created severe physiological challenges. Above 21,000 feet, the body deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels were a fraction of sea level. Altitude sickness could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions within hours. High-altitude pulmonary edema involved fluid accumulation in the lungs, causing breathing difficulty and chest tightness. The only effective treatment was rapid descent to lower elevation. Supplemental oxygen provided temporary relief, but was not a substitute for descent. Climbers needed to carry their own equipment and maintain self-sufficiency even with guide support. The expedition had spent weeks acclimatizing through rotations between camps. Shelby had complained of headaches for multiple days, but insisted they were tension headaches from stress. The lead guide conducted daily health checks. At Camp 2, Shelby's oxygen saturation was measured below the normal range for that altitude. She had developed a persistent dry cough. The guide recommended descending to base camp for rest and monitoring. Shelby refused, stating she was on a schedule and needed to continue upward to Camp 3. She had been asking guides to carry portions of her gear since lower camps. The guides explained that each climber needed to manage their own equipment for safety and self-sufficiency. Shelby argued that she had paid for a premium service and expected accommodation. She stated that carrying equipment was what guides were for. The guides explained that at extreme altitude, each person needed to be self-sufficient. Shelby became irritated and mentioned the significant amount of money she had invested in the expedition. By evening, Shelby's cough had worsened, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. She had difficulty sleeping despite supplemental oxygen. The next morning, the guide strongly recommended she descend immediately to base camp. Shelby refused, saying she hadn't paid thousands of dollars to turn back. She insisted the symptoms were minor and would improve with rest. The guide explained that her symptoms indicated possible pulmonary edema and that continuing upward could be fatal. Shelby became angry and accused them of trying to end the expedition early. She threatened to leave negative reviews and contact the company owner. After extensive discussion, the guides made the decision to begin descending with her, explaining they would not allow her to continue upward in this condition. The descent began mid-morning. Shelby moved slowly, stopping frequently. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing more frequently. As they descended through the western WM toward base camp, she was coughing up small amounts of pink, frothy fluid. The guides increased the pace of descent. Shelby's breathing became increasingly difficult. Her lips had a bluish tint. She stopped and sat down in the snow. The guides administered supplemental oxygen from the emergency supply. They helped her to her feet and supported her weight as they continued descending. Her cough produced more pink froth. As they continued lower, her breathing had become a wet, gurgling sound. She could no longer walk, even with support. The guides radioed ahead for assistance. Additional team members came up from base camp with a rescue sled. Her consciousness was fading. Her breathing became irregular and gasping. The guides placed her on the sled and began moving her downward as quickly as possible. She stopped breathing. They performed resuscitation efforts while continuing to descend toward base camp. She remained unresponsive. They confirmed death after extended efforts. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs had filled with fluid, preventing oxygen from entering the bloodstream. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization response, refusal to descend despite early symptoms, and delayed descent when symptoms became severe. The examiner noted that pulmonary edema was reversible with prompt descent, and that her death could likely have been prevented if she had descended when first advised. The delay had allowed the condition to progress beyond recovery. It was May 18th, 2013, and the Lhotse face gleamed under mid-morning sun like polished blue glass. Fixed ropes running up the face were packed with climbers from multiple teams, each moving at their own pace while Sherpas threaded between them, hauling loads. Nicola Pryor was 39, from London, stuck behind a climber who stopped every 15 steps. Her budget expedition ran large groups with barely any Sherpa support, and the pace was set by the slowest person on the team. Nicola was fitter than all of them, and the frustration had been building since the first rotation. She had noticed the faster expedition days earlier: efficient clients, more oxygen, better gear. On summit push day, she left Camp 3 early and fell in behind the faster group. She clipped onto their rope and slotted herself into their line like she belonged. Kanchanuru, the faster expedition's lead Sherpa, 40 with 12 Everest summits, spotted her at a rest stop around 24,800 feet. He checked with his expedition leader by radio. She wasn't on the manifest. His expedition had contributed to the shared route-fixing effort above Camp 3. The oxygen at Camp 4 was set aside for his clients. Her being there threw off the safety math he was running. Nicola accused him of harassment, told him she'd report him if he kept going. I need to be honest, when I got to this part I had to read it again. She's outside any logistics chain, using oxygen she didn't pay for, with no rescue plan if anything goes wrong, and when the lead Sherpa asks her to leave, she threatens to report him. The audacity is hard to overstate. Kancha made a call. He left her, moved his clients forward, radioed her expedition company, and focused on the people he was actually responsible for. Nicola kept going alone, drifting behind teams she didn't belong to, resting when they rested, moving when they moved. 2 Sherpas from different expeditions later said they saw her take an oxygen bottle from a cache at Camp 4 that was clearly labeled for another team. I want you to think about that. That bottle was carried to 26,000 feet on someone's back, cached for a client who might need it to survive the descent. And she just grabs it. She ducked into an empty tent on the South Col and rested before the summit push. Using shelter she hadn't arranged and fuel she hadn't paid for, she left for the summit that night, following headlamps in the dark, carrying 1 oxygen bottle with no spare and no Sherpa keeping track of her. She reached the balcony at 27,600 feet behind the main groups, already hours deep into her single bottle supply. Above the balcony, the math turned fatal. At the flow rate she was using, her single bottle was nearing depletion. The summit was still 1,400 vertical feet above, no spare, no Sherpa carrying extra supply, and nobody on the mountain tracking where she was. Nicola Pryor was found at around 28,200 feet, slumped against the fixed rope. Climbers coming down from the summit first assumed she was resting. A Sherpa who checked on her 2 hours later found no pulse. She was 39 years old. Nobody on the entire mountain was tracking her. I keep landing on that because it's the thing that makes budget expeditions so dangerous. She walked away from the only people responsible for her, and nothing existed to catch her before the mountain did. Kanchanuru was questioned about leaving her on the rope. Sherpa teams across the mountain backed his decision without exception. He had protected the clients in his care. Budget operators had been a growing problem on Everest for years. They undercut established companies by stripping services to the minimum. Smaller Sherpa teams, fewer oxygen bottles, less communication gear, and almost no oversight once clients left base camp. For climbers who couldn't afford premium expeditions, they were the only option. But the trade-off was simple. You paid less, got less, and when something went wrong above 26,000 feet, nobody was coming. Nicola's expedition couldn't even confirm she was missing until other teams reported it. It was May 21st, 2015, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, just below the Hillary Step. The morning was cold and clear, with steady wind and a slow line of climbers edging upward. Radios crackled intermittently, but otherwise the ridge was quiet. The route looked stable, yet it relied on constant tension, attention, and shared awareness to remain safe. Lucas Benitez was 29, an Argentine audio technician who spent his career managing live sound for touring bands. He was known for staying calm when equipment failed and crowds pressed in. Training runs and long climbs were always done with music, a habit he believed kept his breathing even and his mind steady. His expedition was modest and self-funded, with no sponsors, only encouragement from co-workers who followed his progress online. Lucas understood technical systems. He respected gear and processes, but he trusted routine deeply. On Everest, the southeast ridge is a narrow spine of snow and rock protected by fixed lines. Movement depends on climbers staying clipped, spacing themselves, and responding instantly to changes ahead. At extreme altitude, delays in reaction can be fatal, even when conditions appear controlled. Summit traffic was heavy that morning. Above Camp 4, guides had warned teams to expect congestion near the Hillary Step. Lucas chose to keep his earbuds in, music low but constant, believing it helped regulate his pace. He ignored the suggestion to remove them in crowded sections. He stayed clipped in and advanced when the line moved. Several climbers ahead were negotiating a short rock step. One slipped briefly, unloading the rope before regaining footing. Shouts went up as a warning, but the wind carried sound unevenly. Lucas did not hear them. The fixed line slackened suddenly, then shifted. Seeing movement ahead, Lucas stepped forward. His weight transferred as the rope dropped away from tension. His front boot met empty air where the line had been supporting balance. He pitched forward instantly, momentum carrying him headfirst down the slope. His helmet struck a rock lip, forcing his neck backward beyond its limit. The cervical spine failed at the upper vertebrae. His body continued to tumble, striking snow and stone before sliding to a stop several meters below the line. The fall was violent but brief. Climbers above froze, then radioed for help. One guide descended carefully within minutes, reaching Lucas and attempting an assessment. There was no response, no voluntary movement, and no breathing pattern consistent with life. Earbuds were still seated, music audible in the thin air. Rescue teams were notified immediately, but response at that altitude was limited. It took approximately 40 minutes for additional climbers to secure the area and reach him safely. By then, it was clear there was nothing to be done. Lucas was secured to the line to prevent further sliding. The medical assessment later described a high cervical spine fracture with complete spinal cord transection. The injury would have caused instant paralysis and loss of breathing. Death occurred within seconds of impact. There were no signs of prolonged suffering. No equipment failure was found. The rope, anchors, and carabiners were intact. The incident resulted from a momentary loss of situational awareness during congestion. After the expedition, Lucas's employer posted a short memorial urging climbers to remove headphones above Camp 4. The message was shared widely among mountaineers. It traveled faster than any official advisory. Authorities recorded the death as accidental and closed the route temporarily. Team leaders reviewed communication protocols and spacing rules. No citations were issued. The mountain returned to routine traffic within days after standard internal safety reviews. It was May 15, 2016. Camp 2 on Everest's western Ejibawim sat at over 21,000 feet in extreme cold that quickly degraded the body. By midday, the basin trapped heat, softening surface snow and weakening the glacier beneath the route toward the Lhotse face. Damo Holden, 38, arrived on Everest as an inexperienced climber from Vancouver, Canada. Before the expedition, most of his experience with the outdoors came from short, guided trips and fitness-focused adventure travel. He had never climbed in sustained high-altitude terrain where survival depended on technical movement, pacing, and independent judgment over long periods of exposure. A former real estate developer, Damo approached Everest with the mindset that preparation could be compressed. He trained intensely for months, spent heavily on equipment, and believed discipline and confidence could compensate for lack of mountain experience. That mindset followed him onto the mountain. Feels like he thought Everest was something you could brute force if you wanted it badly enough. Online, he posted constantly about mindset, discomfort, and pushing limits. Most of the footage showed controlled moments around camp or clipped safely to fixed ropes. But the way it was edited made the climb appear far more independent and controlled than it really was. During early rotations through the Khumbu icefall, guides noticed that Damo struggled with efficiency. He overexerted on basic sections, stopped too often to recover, and burned energy at a rate that became noticeable compared to other climbers on the same schedule. His Sherpa guide repeatedly reminded him to slow his pace and conserve strength for higher camps. By the second rotation to Camp 2, small mistakes had started stacking up. He forgot to fully secure a crampon strap before leaving camp one morning, and later misplaced a glove during a rest stop near the base of the Lhotse face. Neither incident caused serious harm, but both reflected declining focus at altitude. Little mistakes up there never stay little for long. Despite the issues, Damo remained determined to prove he could handle the mountain without constant supervision. He began separating himself slightly from the pace set by his Sherpa, especially during descents where terrain looked less technical from above. On the afternoon of May 15th, after completing a rotation above Camp 2, Damo started descending toward camp ahead of the rest of his team. Conditions had warmed significantly inside the western SUWM, and sections of the glacier had become unstable under the midday heat. Visibility remained good, but the route passed through an area broken by hidden crevasses covered with thin snow bridges. Climbers were expected to move carefully, remain clipped properly, and follow the established track exactly. At some point during the descent, Damo stepped several feet off the packed route while trying to bypass slower climbers moving ahead of him. The snow beneath him collapsed instantly. He dropped approximately 30 feet into a narrow crevasse and struck the ice walls multiple times before landing on a sloped section near the bottom. His fall was partially slowed by his pack, but the impact caused significant trauma to his chest, shoulder, and pelvis. The climbers above heard the collapse and radioed Camp 2 immediately. A Sherpa rescue team responded within minutes and located Damo deep inside the crevasse, conscious but unable to move normally. The extraction was difficult due to the narrow opening and unstable snow around the edge. Anchors had to be reset repeatedly as rescuers worked to avoid widening the collapse zone. Honestly, just getting him out alive from that spot already sounded brutal. After nearly 2 hours, rescuers managed to raise him to the surface. By then, his condition had worsened significantly from internal injuries, blood loss, and prolonged cold exposure inside the crevasse. He was transported back to Camp 2 and later evacuated lower on the mountain, but his condition continued deteriorating during the descent. Damo Holden died the following morning from traumatic internal injuries, complicated by hypothermia and high-altitude stress. The expedition review concluded that the initiating factor was deviation from the established route inside hazardous glacier terrain during peak warming conditions. Investigators also noted that Damo's lack of experience moving independently in crevasse zones contributed directly to the fatal decision-making that led to the fall. It was May 19, 2016. The south col of Mount Everest sits at 26,000 feet, and if you've never heard of it, it's basically the last camp before the summit. A flat, wind-blasted plateau where the air has about a third of the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. That morning the sky was clear, temperatures around minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill dragging it even lower. The summit was visible from camp, and I know that sounds like a good sign. It really wasn't. So here's who Derek Savelle was. 31 years old, wellness creator, the kind of person who built an audience by doing hard things and filming them. Cold plunges, extended fasts, high-altitude hikes. The whole brand was built around the idea that discomfort is a choice, and most people just aren't willing to push through it. Everest was supposed to be the proof, the ultimate episode. She had summited 2 6,000-meter peaks before this, which sounds like solid experience. Until you realize the death zone on Everest starts right around where those mountains top out. She joined a commercial expedition as a paying client, showed up with her gear, her camera, and a summit speech she had written and rehearsed for weeks. A scripted speech. Who does that and genuinely thinks it's going to go fine? Now, before we get into what happened, you need to understand something about the death zone. Above 26,000 feet, your body is not maintaining, it is declining. Every minute you spend up there, especially standing still, your core temperature drops, your oxygen saturation drops, your ability to think clearly drops. It's not dramatic, it's just math. And because of that math, guided expeditions set a hard turnaround time, usually between 1 and 2 p.n. No exceptions, no negotiations, regardless of whether you've hit the summit or not. The mountain doesn't care how close you are. Miss that window and you are not getting down safely. That's just how it works. Darixa was already behind schedule before she even got to the hard part. Her Sherpa clocked it at the balcony, 27,600 feet, where she was running about 40 minutes slower than she needed to be. She reached the south summit sometime around midday, just barely inside the window, and right there her Sherpa gave her the options. Push straight to the true summit or turn around. What she could not do, what the situation physically would not allow, was stop and film. So she stopped and filmed. First take, wind noise. Second take, her buff was sitting wrong across her face. She fixed it, reviewed the footage on her camera screen, reset, went again. Her Sherpa warned her. She kept going. Warned her a second time. She kept going. By take 11, she was finally happy with it. Which makes me wonder, what exactly is going through your head on take 9? Take 10? At 28,700 feet, what are you telling yourself? She reached the true summit well past the cutoff. The time-stamped footage later confirmed she had burned through nearly an hour and a half at the south summit alone. The descent started immediately, but her body had already been losing the battle the entire time she was standing still in the cold running takes. By the Hillary step she was stumbling on the fixed ropes. Her Sherpa was getting single-word answers to questions. Not a good sign at any altitude. Genuinely terrifying at this one. Not long after, she sat down on the ridge just below the step. Her Sherpa tried to get her back up, tried to physically support her and move her, but one person cannot carry a non-ambulatory adult at 28,000 feet. It's just not physically possible up there. She lost consciousness roughly 30 minutes after sitting down. No fall, no sudden event. She sat down, and that was it. I think if she had turned around at take 3, even take 5, we're probably not talking about her right now. The Sherpa radioed base camp shortly after she became unresponsive. A second Sherpa was sent up from Camp 4 but didn't reach her before dark. Helicopter rescue above 26,000 feet isn't viable. There's nothing anyone could do from the outside. Every option had already closed. The recovery team reached her the next morning and found her exactly where she had stopped, still seated, still leaning against the ridge. The mountain had just held her there overnight. Recovery wasn't attempted given the location and conditions. Her camera was pulled from her jacket on site, memory card intact. All 11 takes of the summit speech were on it, along with time-stamped footage that confirmed exactly how long she had been standing still at the south summit. That timestamp laid out the entire sequence without a single word needing to be said. Her death was ruled hypothermia, secondary to prolonged exposure above 28,000 feet. Delayed descent and physical exhaustion were listed as contributing factors. The expedition's incident report noted the turnaround advisory had been given twice and declined both times. The case was closed. Darixa came to Everest to get the perfect take. 11 tries in, she got it. She just never got to use it. It was April 14th, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet, where climbers registered with expedition companies and liaison officers before attempting the summit. Denise Carmichael was 42 years old, an insurance claims adjuster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her experience consisted of 2 guided day hikes in Sedona and 1 summit of a 10,000-foot peak in Colorado. She had paid for a budget expedition package, but believed the mandatory liaison officer registration was unnecessary bureaucracy designed to generate revenue rather than ensure safety. Everest's routes above base camp required specialized high-altitude equipment and acclimatization. The Khumbu icefall between base camp and Camp 1 was a maze of shifting ice blocks and hidden crevasses. Weather patterns shifted rapidly at extreme altitude, with temperatures well below freezing even during climbing season. Supplemental oxygen became critical above 26,000 feet. Climbers followed fixed rope routes established by climbing teams. A registration tent at base camp processed climbing permits and route assignments. Denise approached the checkpoint and asked about the route. The liaison officer explained the permit system and the requirement to register her climb with her expedition group. She argued that permits were revenue generation schemes. The officer explained that permits helped coordinate rescues and track climber locations on the mountain. Denise's voice grew louder as she insisted she had prepared thoroughly. She stated that she had paid thousands of dollars for the expedition and had a right to climb independently. Other climbers waiting in line watched the exchange. The officer repeated that climbing without proper registration violated regulations and created safety risks. Denise remained at the checkpoint, arms crossed, insisting the policy was unreasonable. After several more minutes of back and forth, she finally turned away and walked toward the tent area. The next morning, she left base camp before dawn without her assigned group. She carried a day pack that appeared too light for a proper attempt through the icefall. Another climber noticed her heading toward the Khumbu icefall alone. She moved quickly, staying away from the main route where teams were working. She followed a less traveled path through the icefall that experienced climbers avoided due to instability. Denise navigated through the ice formations for some time, gaining elevation. The route narrowed as it approached a section where ice blocks towered overhead. She had minimal equipment and no partner for safety. She began crossing a snow bridge over a crevasse. Her right foot broke through the thin snow layer. She lost balance and fell through the surface. She dropped into the crevasse, falling before wedging between ice walls and a narrow shaft. The fall had caused injuries, including a fractured leg and severe bruising to her torso. She tried to climb out, but couldn't manage the smooth ice walls with her injuries. The crevasse was only a few feet wide at her position, with no way to maneuver. She pulled out her phone, but had no signal. She had limited water and some food. No rope, no ice axe, no emergency beacon beyond her phone. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing. She remained wedged in that position. Hours passed. The limited daylight that reached the crevasse faded. Temperature dropped further as darkness came. By the second day, she was shivering uncontrollably. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated from the cold and altitude. She attempted to shift position, but managed only slight movements. The extreme cold continued. She had been without adequate water. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia, shock from the injuries, dehydration, and altitude effects at nearly 19,000 feet. She lost consciousness sometime on the third day. A team working on the fixed ropes spotted the collapsed snow bridge. They investigated and found her in the crevasse. A rescue team reached her location. She had no pulse and was not breathing. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypothermia, dehydration, shock from untreated injuries, and altitude-related complications. The fractures had caused blood loss and compromised the body's ability to regulate temperature in the extreme cold. Dehydration and the thin air at that elevation had accelerated the decline. The lack of emergency equipment, adequate supplies, and communication devices meant she had no way to signal for help. The death was ruled accidental. Her expedition company reported her missing when she failed to return to base camp. It was April 19, 2017, and the air at Everest Base Camp carried the metallic edge of snow that had melted and refrozen overnight. The temperature sat around 24 degrees Fahrenheit, with gusts pushing through the Khumbu Glacier, strong enough to rattle tent poles and send loose equipment skidding across ice. Prayer flags strung between expedition clusters snapped in bursts, their frayed edges worn thin by seasons of wind and ultraviolet light. The camp was deep into its rhythm. Teams had been on the mountain for weeks, and the icefall doctors had established and maintained the route through the Khumbu since early April. Lauren Shale arrived 3 weeks late. She was 41 years old, a corporate consultant from Denver who had rebranded herself as an adventure athlete after guided trips up Kilimanjaro and a partial ascent of Elbrus. 2 expedition companies had rejected her Everest application for insufficient experience. A third, a budget operator in Kathmandu with a reputation for flexibility, declined at first but reversed the decision after Lauren wired an additional payment to the owner's personal account. The operator reassigned an unused permit from a canceled client and added Lauren to the roster mid-season. The field team was never told. When Lauren showed up at base camp, the expedition leader didn't recognize her. The client manifest listed 7 climbers. Lauren made 8. She produced paperwork showing the Kathmandu office had added her, and a phone call to the operator produced vague confirmation the money had already been accepted. Lakpa Rangdu, the expedition's lead Sherpa, 36 years old with 9 Everest summits, saw the problem right away. Oxygen allocations, tent assignments, food rations, and Sherpa pairings had all been calculated for 7. Adding an 8th without adjustments meant someone would come up short when it mattered. That's what gets me every time with these stories. The guy with 9 summits flags the problem on day 1, and the answer is basically, figure it out. The first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu icefall exposed Lauren completely. She clipped her ascender backward twice. She froze on a ladder crossing until a line of climbers stacked up behind her. Her crampon technique alternated between flat footing, where she should have been front pointing, and dragging her feet in ways that snagged the rope. Lakpa corrected her patiently at first, then firmly, then with visible concern. Other clients on the rotation started requesting different group assignments. Nobody wanted to be roped to someone who couldn't keep pace, and the resentment was building quietly across the team. When Lakpa brought it to the expedition leader, Lauren was standing right there and jumped in, insisting her performance was normal for a first rotation. She name-dropped routes in Patagonia and a winter Denali attempt. A client who had actually climbed the Patagonian route later told the guide team that Lauren's descriptions didn't match the terrain. And look, I've seen climbers stretch their resumes before. Everyone adds a little polish. But making up entire routes you've never set foot on while standing next to people who have, that's a different level. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet confirmed everything. Lauren stumbled on flat glacier terrain, burned through water at twice the rate of other clients, and needed rest stops that pushed the group 2 hours behind. The third rotation reached only 22,800 feet, well short of Camp 3 at 23,500. Lauren couldn't hold front point technique on steep ice. Lakpa had to physically guide her boots into placements. They turned back. Lauren had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet. When the summit window opened, the expedition leader barred Lauren from the push. Her response was controlled, but threatening. She would contact the Kathmandu operator, have the guide replaced, and pursue legal action for services not rendered. She appeared to accept the decision. She did not. Lauren tagged along with another team's rope line during the afternoon, pushed to the South Col. In the crowding and wind, Sherpas assumed she belonged to a neighboring expedition. That night, Lakpa found her on the fixed ropes at 27,000 feet, climbing alone in the dark with no Sherpa assigned. Base camp radioed to turn her around, but pulling someone off a fixed rope who won't cooperate at that altitude risks both lives. Lauren refused to go down. They found her body the following afternoon at around 27,800 feet, seated against a rock band above the balcony. Her oxygen mask hung around her neck. Her hands were bare. Her eyes were open. She had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet, and cerebral edema had done what it always does to unprepared bodies. She was 41 years old. The bare hands are the detail I keep coming back to. Severe haste destroys judgment so completely that climbers stop protecting themselves from the cold. The brain can't process danger anymore. She was freezing to death and didn't have the awareness left to care. The Kathmandu operator faced investigation. 2 legitimate clients on the expedition failed to summit because Lauren's presence had thrown off the rotation schedule and squeezed their acclimatization windows. It was May 19, 2016, on the South Col Road of Mount Everest, at the Geneva Spur Traverse, around 26,800 feet. The morning was clear but bitterly cold, and the fixed line cut across a slope of blue ice exposed to constant wind. Climbers were stalled by traffic, standing still in an environment where standing still steadily drains the body. Nothing failed all at once. The danger accumulated quietly during the wait. Thomas Ilić was 41, a Serbian civil engineer who spent weekdays managing infrastructure projects and weekends training for endurance events. He approached Everest the same way he approached work, with spreadsheets, schedules, and contingency tables. Teammates respected his discipline, but noticed his fixation on timing. He believed delays were the most dangerous variable on the mountain, something to be minimized at all costs. Ravi Patel was 34, an Indian logistics coordinator on his first 8,000-meter peak. He was fit at lower altitudes, but had limited experience above 7,000 meters. Ravi was optimistic to a fault, trusting that effort and positive thinking could compensate for acclimatization gaps. He carried standard supplemental oxygen and followed a commercial plan, but his preparation at extreme altitude was thin. The traverse backed up as climbers ahead struggled to move efficiently. Ravi arrived late to the line, visibly hypoxic, his movements sloppy and speech slurred. He fumbled with his carabiner and leaned heavily on the rope. Thomas noticed the delay, pushing his schedule past the planned turnaround window. Wind chill dropped temperatures near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing moisture instantly. Ravi stopped completely, breathing hard, unable to coordinate clipping and unclipping. Thomas weighed the choice quickly. Leaving Ravi there meant further delay and risk to everyone behind. He removed his own regulator and handed it over, intending to help Ravi recover for a minute and keep the line moving. Thomas remained clipped but was now breathing ambient air in the death zone. As Ravi increased his oxygen flow, moisture inside the regulator condensed and froze. The valve iced internally, sealing shut. Oxygen delivery stopped without warning. Ravi's breathing grew frantic as he tugged at the hose, unable to understand why nothing was coming through. Thomas inhaled deeply, expecting relief that never arrived. Thomas dropped to one knee, then tipped sideways onto the icy traverse. His helmet struck the slope, and he lay still, his body starved of oxygen. Ravi, panicking and nearly blind from hypoxia, stepped over him. His boots skidded on polished ice. The Jamar on his line failed to reseat as he loaded it unevenly. Ravi slid, accelerated, struck the slope once, and vanished over the edge below the fixed line. Moments later, Thomas attempted to recover, reaching weakly for the rope. His tether failed to hold on the icy sheath. He was pulled from the traverse and fell after Ravi, out of sight. Climbers above called the incident immediately over the radio. No rescue was possible at that altitude and location. Both men fell hundreds of feet. Recovery was delayed by the weather and traffic. The post-mortem examination concluded that both deaths began with acute hypoxia, followed by massive blunt force trauma. Ravi's regulator was recovered later, the valve frozen shut with zero airflow. Thomas showed no evidence of supplemental oxygen use at the time of his fall. Thomas's planning documents circulated quietly among teammates afterward as an example of schedule pressure overriding judgment. Ravi's family received the recovered regulator months later, and the internal ice was still locking the valve in place. It was May 22nd, 2017. Everest's southeast ridge, above 26,000 feet, began under clear, stable conditions, with temperatures near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Within hours, a fast-moving weather system moved in, dropping visibility to near zero and erasing the fixed route, turning navigation into immediate survival. Raymond Okafor, 47, arrived on Everest as an inexperienced climber from Portland, Oregon. He didn't have any real mountaineering background and was stepping into one of the most technical and extreme environments in the world without having built prior climbing experience. His preparation was structured, but it didn't come from time spent in progressively harder mountain terrain or situations where he had to make decisions on his own. Feels like he was trying to learn the hard part while already inside it. Everything he'd learned still felt new once he got on Everest. Even basic tools like the GPS weren't familiar to him beyond seeing them shown once. He'd never had to use them in bad visibility or under pressure, when quick decisions actually matter. He began his summit push from Camp 4 at 26,300 feet with his Sherpa guide, moving steadily through the night. Early progress was controlled and on schedule. By the time they reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, the ascent was proceeding as planned, with nothing indicating immediate risk. At roughly 28,100 feet, the situation began to change. The team was forced into a turnaround below the south summit as conditions tightened and the weather window closed earlier than expected. The descent began just as the environment deteriorated. Within less than half an hour, cloud cover rolled in and visibility dropped to under 60 feet. Wind increased sharply and the ridge lost all identifiable reference points. At approximately 26,800 feet, Raymond was instructed to continue descending alone along the fixed rope toward Camp 4, while assistance was diverted to another climber in distress nearby. The expectation was that he would remain en route until support rejoined him. He entered the whiteout alone. Being told to keep going in those conditions sounds simple, but it really isn't. For several hundred feet, Raymond followed the fixed line correctly. At around 26,600 feet, the rope ended at a standard anchor point, with the next section beginning a short distance away across an open slope. In clear conditions, this transition was simple. In whiteout conditions, there were no visible markers, no contrast, and no sense of direction. Raymond stepped in the wrong direction. He moved sideways across the slope, but the ground soon tilted too steeply and stopped him. The fixed ropes had disappeared into the storm, and everything around him looked the same under blowing snow. With no clear point of reference left, he sat down and tried to radio for help, but the wind tore his transmission apart before it could get through. He then reached for his GPS device, hoping it would provide direction. It displayed coordinates correctly, but he had never been trained to interpret or translate them into a usable route in terrain like this. It confirmed where he was, not how to return. He remained stationary. At that altitude, stopping movement accelerates heat loss rapidly. His insulated suit was designed for climbing, not for prolonged immobility in extreme wind. As minutes passed, his body temperature dropped. Shivering weakened, coordination failed, and fine motor control began to disappear. Camp 4 received fragmented communication and dispatched a support Sherpa into the whiteout. The search was slow and difficult, with near zero visibility and no landmarks to follow. After an extended search, Raymond was located a short distance off the fixed route. By that point, he was unconscious and severely hypothermic, with no effective response to stimulation. Resuscitation and warming were attempted immediately in the field, but his condition had already progressed beyond recovery under those environmental conditions. He did not survive the descent effort back toward Camp 4. Raymond O'Kafer was pronounced dead due to severe hypothermia, following prolonged exposure in whiteout conditions. The expedition review identified 3 contributing factors: rapid weather collapse, loss of visual reference on the ridge, and Raymond's lack of independent navigation capability. While the GPS functioned correctly, it had never been trained into practical use, leaving it ineffective in the only conditions where it mattered. It was April 28, 2015. The Khumbu Valley was still unsettled. 3 days earlier, the Gorkha earthquake had torn through Nepal and sent shockwaves up the mountain that scattered teams, collapsed sections of the icefall, and killed climbers at base camp. But higher on the mountain, above the immediate chaos, a narrow weather window had cracked open. A handful of teams were still moving, and one climber in particular was moving fast. Not because of the window, but because of someone else. Zoran Ashby was the kind of guy who turned everything into a competition. 27 years old, fitness creator, built his whole channel around one idea: that most people are just soft. No excuses, no rest days, no slow and steady. He had learned sometime before the summit push that another creator he had publicly positioned himself against was on the mountain with a separate expedition and was ahead of him in acclimatization rotations. So Zoran pushed for the summit after completing only one rotation to Camp 2 instead of the standard 2. His expedition leader flagged it. Zoran said he felt fine. He had summited peaks up to 6,400 meters before, never anything close to Everest, and I think he genuinely believed his fitness would cover the gap. That's the thing about the mountain. It doesn't care how strong you are. Here's something most people don't think about when it comes to high altitude climbing. Acclimatization isn't optional, it's biological. Your body needs time to adjust to the drop in oxygen pressure, and there's no shortcut for that process, regardless of fitness level. Skip the rotations and you're essentially rolling the dice on whether your body can cope with what's coming. The symptoms of a body that can't cope start subtle: a cough, some breathlessness, fatigue, easy to dismiss, easy to push through if pushing through is your whole identity. The problem is that above 23,000 feet, subtle doesn't stay subtle for long. At Camp 3, 24,500 feet, Zoran developed a persistent cough he told his Sherpa was just the dry air. His expedition doctor at base camp picked up on something during a radio check and recommended he descend for observation. Zoran declined. He cited his rival's position on the mountain. That night he slept badly, and by morning his lips had taken on a faint bluish tint his Sherpa recognized immediately. Reminds me of other cases I've covered where everyone around the victim saw it, coming before the victim did. And still, he packed up and pushed toward Camp 4. At what point do you stop calling it confidence and start calling it something else? He didn't make it far. Within 2 hours of leaving Camp 3, he had fallen well behind the group. The Sherpa behind him noted his pace had become slow and irregular. His breathing had changed too. The Sherpa could hear it, a wet, crackling sound with each exhale, the kind that doesn't come from dry air or exertion. At around 25,800 feet, he stopped moving and sat down on his pack. His Sherpa reached him within minutes. Zoran was conscious but confused. Couldn't answer what day it was. Couldn't track a simple question. His oxygen saturation read 48% on the Sherpa's pulse oximeter. To put that in context, a healthy person at sea level sits around 95 to 99%. Even accounting for altitude, 48% is critical. Fluid had filled a significant portion of both lungs. He could not stand without help. 2 Sherpas began a new, immediate descent with him, supported between them. He lost consciousness before they had covered much ground. CPR was performed on the slope for 14 minutes. He didn't respond. 14 minutes on a near vertical slope at 25,000 feet. I want you to think about what that actually looks like. Base camp was notified and a helicopter evacuation was requested, but weather conditions in the valley, still unstable in the days following the earthquake, made a high-altitude extraction impossible that morning. The team held position for 2 hours before confirming he had no pulse. His body was evacuated by helicopter 2 days later when conditions finally allowed it. I've covered deaths that were sudden and deaths that were slow. This one sits somewhere uncomfortable in between because there was a clear window where he could have turned around and chose not to. The postmortem confirmed bilateral pulmonary edema as cause of death. Both lungs had accumulated fluid, consistent with rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization. His camera was recovered at Camp 3. The last thing on it was a clip filmed the morning of his final push, him visibly struggling to finish sentences, breathless between every few words. The expedition's radio logs confirmed the descent recommendation had been issued and declined roughly 18 hours before he died. The case was ruled accidental, with self-directed deviation from the acclimatization protocol listed as the primary contributing factor. Zoran had spent years telling his audience that the body could handle anything if the mind was strong enough. Everest answered that one for him. It was May 19th, 2014. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet in the death zone, where climbers made their final preparations before summit attempts during narrow weather windows. Lorraine Vasquez was 45 years old, a dental hygienist from Portland, Oregon. She had paid significant money for a commercial expedition package with a well-known guiding company. Her climbing experience was limited to guided trips on lower altitude peaks. She had trained for over a year, but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and had made the expedition a central part of her identity for the past year. Everest's summit push from the South Col required climbers to ascend over 3,000 feet through the death zone, where the human body deteriorates rapidly due to oxygen deprivation. The standard protocol involved leaving Camp 4 around midnight to reach the summit by mid-morning and descend before afternoon weather deteriorated. Turnaround times were strictly enforced regardless of summit success. Climbers who stayed too long at altitude risked exhaustion, disorientation, and being caught descending in darkness. The descent was statistically more dangerous than the ascent, requiring full concentration and remaining in energy reserves. The expedition leader conducted a briefing at Camp 4 the evening before the summit push. He emphasized the turnaround time of 1 p.m., regardless of position on the mountain. Lorraine made a dismissive comment about having come too far to turn back early, and that she hadn't paid this much money to follow arbitrary time limits. Lorraine reached the summit at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the turnaround time. The guide said they needed to begin descending. Lorraine pulled out her phone and camera. She began taking photos and videos. The guide reminded her of the turnaround time. Lorraine said she needed more time after everything she had been through. The guide explained they needed to leave immediately to descend safely before dark. Lorraine argued that 15 minutes wouldn't matter. She continued taking photos from different angles. Other climbers from different expeditions were also on the summit, creating congestion. The guide's voice became firm as he stated they were leaving now. Lorraine responded that she had paid for this experience and deserved time to enjoy it. She mentioned the money she had invested and said she would leave negative reviews if she was rushed. By the time Lorraine agreed to descend, over half an hour had passed. The guide was visibly concerned as they began the descent. The route down was slow due to other climbers. By the time they reached the south summit, Lorraine's pace had slowed noticeably. The guide stayed close to her, monitoring her condition. As they descended further, Lorraine began stopping more frequently. Her movements became sluggish. The guide asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired. By late afternoon, they were still well above safe elevation. Daylight was fading. The guide radioed for additional support. Lorraine sat down on the snow and said she needed to rest. The guide tried to get her moving, explaining that stopping in the death zone was dangerous. Lorraine's responses became slower and less coherent. She was showing signs of severe exhaustion and altitude effects. The guide attempted to help her stand, but she couldn't maintain her balance. Her oxygen supply was running low. The guide shared his oxygen with her, but his own supply was also limited. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped further. Another guide from a different expedition reached their position and assisted. They tried to move Lorraine downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She slumped against the slope. Her breathing became shallow. The guides continued efforts to revive her and move her, but she became unresponsive. Despite continued rescue efforts through the night, she did not regain consciousness. Her body was found the next morning by a descending team, located on the route above the balcony where she had collapsed. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from exhaustion and exposure in the death zone, complicated by altitude effects and oxygen depletion. The extended time at extreme altitude, combined with the physical demands of the climb and descent, had depleted her body's reserves. The delay in beginning the descent had left insufficient time and energy to reach safety before darkness and extreme cold set in. Evidence, including radio communications and witness statements, established that she had exceeded the turnaround time and spent excessive time on the summit despite warnings. The death was ruled accidental. It was April 29, 2016, and the Khumbu icefall groaned in the afternoon heat. At 29 degrees Fahrenheit, meltwater trickling through the glacier was undermining ice structures that cracked and settled all through the night. Above, Syrinx tilted at angles that looked like decisions waiting to be made. Vanessa Holt was 36, from Sydney, a former fitness influencer whose follower count had peaked around 85,000 and dropped to about 40,000. Everest was supposed to turn that around, but before leaving Australia, she'd set up a financial backstop. 3 overlapping adventure insurance policies from different providers, each covering evacuation and rescue costs. She believed the overlap would let her recover far more than the rescues actually cost. Her climbing Sherpa was Ang Cheering, 35 8 Everest summits, from Kunde. Known for one thing above all, he was always the first to move when someone needed help. 14 seasons of rescue work at altitude. That instinct was exactly what Vanessa was counting on. The first staged emergency came at Camp 1. Vanessa reported severe abdominal pain. A helicopter was called. She got flown to Kathmandu, examined, and they found nothing wrong. She filed an insurance claim within 48 hours and was back at base camp 3 days later. The second came at Camp 2. She hyperventilated on purpose and put on symptoms that looked like early-stage pulmonary edema. The expedition doctor found no fluid in her lungs but couldn't rule out early HAPE at that altitude. She got evacuated again. Second claim filed. Ang Chiring helped with the Camp 2 response, hauling supplemental oxygen across the glacier to the landing zone, adding wear on his body during an already brutal season. Between evacuations, other Sherpas noticed Vanessa bounced back too fast and showed no leftover symptoms. She came back each time with a readiness that looked more like planning than recovery. Ang Chiring told the expedition leader what he suspected, but the leader had no medical grounds to cut her. And that's the part that really gets under my skin with this one. Everyone suspected. The Sherpa saw it, the expedition leader saw it, the pattern was right there. But you can't definitively prove someone isn't sick at 21,000 feet, so nobody could stop her. She found a gap in the system and ran it 3 times. The third staged emergency was the most dangerous. At Camp 3, 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, Vanessa took medications that brought on vomiting and a racing heart. At that altitude, the symptoms were impossible to tell apart from severe acute mountain sickness. She called for help. Ang Chiring heard the radio call from above Camp 3, where he was pre-staging oxygen for the summit push. He came down to her within 30 minutes, moving fast over steep ice the way someone does after doing it dozens of times. What he found looked real. Vomiting, racing pulse, flushed skin. He started lowering her on the fixed ropes. During the descent, wind picked up on the exposed face, gusting to 35 miles per hour. The rescue became a real emergency, no matter whether the patient's condition was genuine. Ang Chiring was managing a body on 45-degree ice in worsening weather at 23,000 feet. At around 22,800 feet, the ice anchor he was waiting fractured. The screw pulled through a surface layer weakened by freeze-thaw cycling. Ang Chiring dropped 30 feet before his backup anchor caught. His body slammed into the ice wall, and the force went straight through his lower left leg. Compound fracture. Tibia and fibula both snapped, bone showing through his climbing suit. Bone through the suit. And what kills me is this is a man who was pre-staging oxygen for other people when that radio call came in. He wasn't even supposed to be on that section of the face. He went because that's what he always does. Vanessa, still clipped into the lowering system, slid 50 feet before the rope caught her. She slammed into a rock, outcropping at speed. The impact fractured her pelvis, broke ribs, and ruptured something internal. A second rescue team got to them within 2 hours. Ang Chiring, conscious with his leg shattered, talked the arriving Sherpas through the anchor setup, which screws were holding, which ropes were loaded, how to get Vanessa off the face without collapsing what was left. They got Vanessa down to Camp 2 by nightfall. The internal bleeding had been working for hours. Her skin was gray, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. Conditions wouldn't allow a helicopter until morning. She died in the medical tent at Camp 2 before dawn. She was 36. Her third emergency on Everest was the only real one, and it killed her. The 2 insurance claims she'd already filed triggered a review. Both insurers investigated and denied coverage. The full scope of the fraud came out in the weeks that followed. Ang Chiring went through 3 surgeries in Kathmandu over 6 months. The fracture healed, but the joint damage was permanent. He couldn't climb above base camp anymore. 14 years of being the first to show up when someone needed help ended by someone who never needed help at all. His family lost more than half their income. Western climbers who knew him put together a fund that covered the surgeries but couldn't replace what the mountain had given him. A reporter asked him the following year if he was angry at Vanessa Holt. He said anger takes energy he was using for other things. When asked what those things were, he said he was learning to walk on flat ground the way he used to walk on ice. One step at a time, trusting the surface beneath him. I've ended a lot of these videos and moved on, but that answer is one I can't let go of. Learning to walk on flat ground the way he used to walk on ice. 14 years on that mountain, and that's how it ends. 6 climbers, 6 lies, and the people who paid the highest price weren't the ones who told them. It was May 17th, 2013, near the south summit of Mount Everest. A narrow ridge carried a fragile cornice outward into space, shaped by days of wind and new snow. Climbers moved cautiously, aware that the ridge held weight only when treated gently. The danger was not hidden. It waited for attention to drift. Ethan Brooks was 36, a freelance videographer who made his living selling dramatic outdoor footage. He chased moments that felt earned, believing proximity created truth. Sponsors were informal, small production houses, and expedition operators who promised exposure rather than protection. He was skilled with cameras and calm under pressure, but framing often replaced caution. Oleg Kuznetsov was 44, a Russian climber on his final push. He moved slowly, clearly exhausted, his steps heavy and uneven. At this altitude, the ridge demands constant balance. Cornices form when wind deposits snow beyond solid ground, creating an unsupported shelf that can break without warning. Traffic was compressed near the south summit. Ethan stopped to film Oleg struggling, speaking softly as the camera rolled. He wanted the contrast between effort and exposure. Oleg paused, breathing hard, leaning on his axe. Guides ahead had warned about soft edges, but the moment felt controlled. Ethan backed up for a wider angle, eyes fixed on the viewfinder. His heel pressed into the cornice. The snow fractured cleanly. There was no sag, only a sudden release. The overhang collapsed, taking both men with it. They dropped together, bodies briefly suspended before the slope pulled them down. The falling mass triggered a small slab that carried them faster, tumbling and striking rock beneath the snow. Within seconds, they disappeared from view. Climbers above shouted and radioed for help. A call went out immediately. No one could descend safely onto the broken slope. Wind filled the air with drifting snow. Rescue teams reached the area hours later, but the slide path was silent. Recovering weeks later, both men had extensive blunt force injuries. Bones were broken throughout, and internal organs were destroyed. Death occurred during the fall, not afterward. The camera was recovered intact. Its final file contained shaking footage and wind noise, ending abruptly. The incident was logged as a fatal cornice collapse. No equipment failure was identified. The footage was archived by the expedition company. It was never released. Investigators noted the cornice line extended beyond the rock's spine, unsupported by ice. Weather records showed recent loading from crosswinds. The sequence matched eyewitness accounts and terrain evidence. No violations were cited, as filming had not breached any explicit rule. After the season, expedition briefings changed. Camera use was restricted on exposed ridges. Ethan's final project credit was removed. Oleg's name was added to the year's memorial list. The mountain kept its schedule, and teams returned when the window reopened. Lessons were shared quietly, without clips or commentary. Family notifications followed standard protocol. Effects were cataloged and returned later. Insurance claims closed the case administratively. No further action was recommended. Guides reiterated spacing, awareness, and cornice avoidance in subsequent briefings. The ridge remained exposed to the same forces. Conditions are repeated yearly. Attention determined outcomes. The loss entered statistics, not headlines. A reminder carried in training notes and margins. Records listed time, location, and cause. Names were logged and dates filed. No anomalies remained. Operations resumed per plan, and traffic normalized. Silence returned to the ridge, shaped again by wind and snow, alone. It was May 11th, 2016. The Lhotse face above Camp 2 on Everest sat in shadow at over 21,000 feet, with temperatures near -15 degrees Fahrenheit and wind-polished ice. Rising at 45 to 55 degrees, it demanded precise front-point technique, where efficiency mattered more than strength for survival. Maston Trent, 38, arrived that season as an inexperienced climber from Denver, Colorado, with a strong fitness background, but little real mountaineering experience. He worked as a personal trainer and built his identity around measurable performance, powerlifting, endurance training, and marathon running. But that conditioning didn't translate into technical alpine skill. He had completed a few non-technical hikes and guided trips on lower peaks, including Kilimanjaro and several Colorado 14ers, but none of them involved sustained steep ice, fixed rope systems, or high-exposure climbing. His only real exposure to crampons and glacier travel came from a single guided session on moderate terrain, leaving him underprepared for the demands of Everest's upper slopes. Not much to fall back on when things get real up there. From the start, his fitness stood out. On early rotations, guides could see he was stronger than most clients on the mountain, but strength wasn't the issue. Technique was. On fixed ropes, Maston kept doing what worked in the gym, pulling with his arms, climbing hand over hand instead of letting his legs and crampons do the work. Dorje, his Sherpa, noticed it early and told him to fix it. Maston understood, but on Everest understanding doesn't always turn into change. By the time they were on the Lhotse face, that habit was catching up with him. Every meter higher, his arms were burning out faster than his legs could recover, and the small, stabilizing muscles he actually needed were getting exhausted. Dorje saw it clearly and told him to stop and reset his pace. Maston pushed on anyway. You can see the overloaded building in real time. At around 23,100 feet, he briefly stepped off the fixed line to bypass a buried section of rope. His crampon slipped on wind-polished ice, but he caught himself and kept moving. The incident indicated reduced control, but he chose to continue. Near 23,400 feet, visible fatigue had set in. His arms were shaking as he paused at an anchor point. He estimated Camp 3 was less than 1,000 vertical feet above, and pushed forward despite increasing instability in his movement. Shortly after, his right crampon loosened when the heel bail shifted out of position. He stopped on the face to fix it, removing his glove in the process. Within minutes, 3 fingers on his right hand showed early frost nip. His grip strength declined noticeably. Dorje called for descent. Maston resisted briefly, then agreed. During the descent at approximately 23,500 feet, his technique remained compromised. As he stepped down onto a section of hard, polished ice, his left crampon failed to seat securely. He instinctively grabbed the fixed rope with both hands, but his right hand, affected by frost nip, could not hold full weight. He slipped. The fall lasted only a few seconds. He dropped roughly 6 feet before the rope system caught him, swinging him hard into the ice face. The impact drove his right hip and lower back into the surface. He remained attached to the rope but could not stand. Dorje secured him immediately to the nearest anchor and radioed for assistance. 2 Sherpas from a nearby team arrived within an hour. During the slow assisted descent from 23,500 feet toward Camp 2, Maston's condition steadily worsened. He showed increasing signs of internal injury and shock, and had to be lowered in stages over steep, exposed terrain. The evacuation took more than 4 hours. By the time they reached lower camp, he had slipped fully into unconsciousness and wasn't responding to anything around him. The team kept working on him, trying to stabilize him for evacuation, but his condition kept getting worse during the transfer setup. Not long after, his heart stopped and resuscitation efforts failed. Maston Trent was pronounced dead at Camp 2 later that day. The expedition report identified the primary cause as technique failure under fatigue. By relying on upper body strength instead of proper crampon use, Maston had exhausted the very muscles needed to maintain balance and control on descent. The loosened crampon and reduced hand function were contributing factors, but the underlying issue was inefficient movement on terrain that required precision. It was May 7, 2014. The Lhotse face, a 4,000-foot wall of blue glacial ice rising from Camp 2 toward Camp 3, was in its standard early May condition. Hard, steep, and completely unforgiving. Fixed ropes ran the full length of it, anchored at intervals into the ice. Temperature on the face that morning was sitting around -15 degrees Fahrenheit with moderate wind. For most teams, it was a routine rotation day. For one climber, it was the last morning of his life. Kalen Riker was 33, and his whole channel was built on one thing: gear. Reviews, comparisons, recommendations. Brands paid him to feature their equipment because his audience actually trusted what he said. That trust was the entire business. For the Everest expedition, he had received a full kit sponsorship covering ascenders, carabiners, harness, and crampons, all rated and certified for high altitude use. Before departing, he returned the certified ascender and primary carabiner set to the sponsors, kept the reimbursement value, and sourced cheaper, non-certified replacements from an online supplier. Told nobody. He had climbed to 6,000 meters before and figured the swap was low risk. The gear looked identical, and that was the whole idea. I've covered a lot of cases where the decision that kills someone happens weeks before they ever get into trouble. This is one of those. So here's what an ascender actually does. It's a mechanical device that grips a fixed rope and lets you move upward on it. On a near vertical ice face, it's essentially what keeps you on the mountain. The cam mechanism inside has to work reliably in extreme cold, and that's exactly what certified gear is rated for. Cheaper non-certified versions are built to lower tolerances. weaker springs, inferior alloys, and in sub-zero temperatures, those tolerances can give out in ways you can't predict and can't recover from. On a 45-degree ice face, that kind of failure doesn't come with a warning. It just happens. During the first rotation to Camp 2, Kalen noticed his ascender felt a little stiff, but worked it manually and kept going. He even filmed a short kit review clip at Camp 2. The non-certified ascender right there in the footage, and he's naming the certified brand on camera without missing a beat. Didn't even hesitate. On the second rotation toward Camp 3 on May 7th, the overnight temperature drop had stiffened the cam mechanism even further. He was about 1,100 feet above Camp 2 on the Lhotse face when he stopped to adjust his pack. Completely routine, the kind of stop you make without thinking about it. He unweighted his ascender to reposition it higher on the rope. Standard move. Every climber on that face does it constantly. The cam didn't re-engage. He put his full body weight onto it, assuming it had locked. It hadn't. The ascender slipped down the rope before he even registered what was happening, and by then his weight was already committed. He, Amai, grabbed the fixed rope with his right hand, but it was iced over and his glove couldn't get enough grip. He went backward off the face. The fall ran roughly 300 feet before the fixed rope system caught him, but the arrest was violent. He hit the ice face during the fall and came to a stop against the rope anchor. A climbing team below saw the whole thing and reached him within 15 minutes. He was alive but unresponsive, visible head trauma, suspected spinal injury. He died before any descent could be organized. The witness team radioed base camp straight away. A helicopter was dispatched, but the Lhotse face doesn't allow for landing. It could only observe. Getting him off that face with the personnel on hand wasn't realistic. He was confirmed dead at the scene about 40 minutes after the fall. Here's the thing about this case that I find hard to shake. The fraud didn't come out on the mountain. It came out after. The ascender was recovered with the body and examined by the expedition's equipment team. Non-certified product, completely inconsistent with the brand Kalen had been claiming to use. Sponsor records confirmed the certified gear had been returned before he even left. The swap was deliberate, it was documented, and it was fatal. The camera footage from Camp 2 was recovered and reviewed. That kit review clip where he's holding the counterfeit gear and naming the certified brand is sitting right there in the incident record. Cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries consistent with a high-altitude fall. Equipment failure cited as the primary contributing factor. The gear discrepancy was formally documented and passed to the relevant authorities. No ambiguity, no loose ends. He had built an entire channel on the credibility of his gear recommendations, pocketed the budget that was supposed to keep him alive, and the mountain collected what was owed. It was May 8, 2016. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sat at 21,300 feet, where climbers acclimatize before attempting higher camps during the narrow weather windows of climbing season. Valerie Hutchins was 38 years old, a housewife from Boston, Massachusetts. Her husband was a surgeon, and she had arranged childcare for their 2 children specifically for this expedition. Her climbing experience included guided trips to lower altitude peaks during favorable conditions, but she had never climbed above 20,000 feet. She had planned this Everest expedition for over a year as a personal challenge. She viewed weather forecasts with skepticism, believing they were often exaggerated to avoid liability. Everest's upper camps involved extreme altitude and exposure to severe weather. May marked the brief climbing season, but conditions remained unpredictable with sudden storms. Temperatures could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The route above Camp 2 crossed exposed terrain with limited shelter. Supplemental oxygen became increasingly important at higher elevations. Equipment failure or exposure at extreme altitude could be fatal within hours. The expedition leader had received weather reports predicting dangerous wind speeds and deteriorating conditions for the upper mountain. Forecasts showed a storm system moving in earlier than the planned weather window. The leader called a meeting the evening before to postpone the move to Camp 3 at 25,000 feet. Valerie argued for over 15 minutes about the decision. The leader explained that conditions exceeded safe parameters for the team. Valerie stated she had arranged her entire schedule around this expedition and had paid significant money. The leader offered to wait for better conditions in several days. Valerie refused, saying this was her only opportunity and that she had already been away from her children for weeks. The next morning before dawn, she left Camp 2 without her team. Other climbers noticed her heading up the route alone. She carried supplemental oxygen, but her pack appeared lighter than recommended. Another climber called out to her about the weather forecast. Valerie responded that forecasts were usually wrong and that she had proper gear. She insisted she knew her capabilities. The other climber returned to his tent. She climbed through the early morning, following the fixed ropes. The first several hours were manageable as she gained elevation. Higher up, wind speeds increased noticeably. She continued upward into more exposed terrain. Valerie reached higher on the route by mid-morning. Cloud cover had moved in and light snow began falling. Wind speeds had increased significantly. She pulled her down suit tighter and continued climbing. Visibility dropped steadily as conditions worsened. She paused at a section of fixed rope to adjust her oxygen mask. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. Despite insulated gloves, she continued for another stretch, gaining more elevation. A particularly strong gust knocked her off balance. She stumbled and fell against rock. Her down suit tore on the exposed edge. Wind began penetrating the damaged section. She stood and tried to continue, but the wind had intensified to dangerous levels. Visibility had decreased to only a few feet. She could barely see the fixed ropes ahead. She attempted to descend, but her coordination was deteriorating. Her movements became increasingly erratic as altitude and cold took their toll. The conditions made it difficult to navigate, even with the fixed lines. She moved slowly, expending energy, and losing body heat through the damaged suit. She began shivering. Snow accumulated on her clothing and equipment. She found a small area behind a rock outcrop and crouched down. The wind still reached her at that elevation. Over the next hours, her shivering decreased as her core temperature dropped. She became lethargic. Her oxygen supply was running low. She attempted to change the cylinder, but her coordination had failed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She slumped against the rocks. Her body was found 3 days later by a team moving between camps, located off the main route where she had sheltered. She was partially buried by snow that had accumulated during the storm. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as severe hypothermia, combined with altitude-related complications. The damaged down suit had accelerated heat loss at extreme altitude. She had been inadequately prepared for solo climbing in deteriorating conditions, lacking backup support and sufficient oxygen reserves. Her oxygen system showed she had depleted her supply. The death was determined to be accidental. It was May 8th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp was bright and still, the sun softening the glacier into a wet sheen. The temperature hit 31 degrees Fahrenheit, mild enough to make the mountain feel almost welcoming. Andrea Farr was 47, from Miami, a hedge fund manager who solved problems with capital. Mountains, she was finding out, didn't respond to money. Her body needed weeks to adapt to altitude, and no wire transfer could speed that up. She had done one rotation to Camp 1, which wiped her out more than expected. The schedule called for 2 more over 10 days. Andrea saw dead time. The arrangement went through a helicopter company in Kathmandu. Fake a knee injury, get evacuated, have the helicopter land at Camp 2 instead of flying to Kathmandu. She iced and compressed her knee overnight to create swelling. The expedition doctor found inflammation that looked like a soft tissue injury and called for evacuation. I've covered a lot of shortcuts people take on this mountain, but this one is something else. You can buy your way past a lot of things in life, but you cannot buy your way past biology. Red blood cells don't care how much money you have. The helicopter lifted off from base camp and instead of heading to Kathmandu, set down at Camp 2 on the western CWM. Cash to intermediaries ensured the flight log listed a weather diversion near Farich. Andrea stepped onto the glacier at 21,000 feet with a body that had spent one night above 19,000. Her blood hadn't adapted, her lungs hadn't adjusted, her brain hadn't recalibrated. Every system still thought it was at sea level. Sonam Rinjing, 31, her assigned climbing Sherpa with 6 summits, came up with a regular rotation the next day and found Andrea already in her tent. The knee looked fine. Sonam checked with base camp, confirmed the story, and reported what he saw. This woman had not acclimatized. Taking her higher was a medical risk. Andrea waved it off and reminded everyone what she'd paid. They let her try for Camp 3 with close monitoring. At 22,500 feet, altitude her body had zero adaptation for, she got hit with a crushing headache. Her coordination fell apart. Her crampon placements were sloppy. Sonam watched her responses come slower, watched her eyes glaze over, watched acute mountain sickness speed toward something worse. Sonam told her to go down. Andrea refused. She made it to 23,000 feet before she couldn't clip her own ascender without someone guiding her hands. Her words were garbled. She kept fumbling gears she'd used for weeks. Full haste, severe cerebral edema shutting her brain down. Sonam and a second Sherpa started lowering her down the Lhotse face. Andrea turned combative, her dying brain reading rescue as an attack. She swung her arms, fighting them. And here's the thing that wrecks me about HACE. The person you're saving fights you. They don't understand you're helping. Their brain turns rescue into threat, and Sonam is absorbing punches on steep ice, trying to keep this woman alive. Her ice axe caught Sonam in the shoulder. In the same moment, Andrea unclipped her own harness. She slid right away on the steep ice and fell roughly 800 feet before hitting a rock shelf. The injuries were catastrophic. 800 feet. That's roughly the height of a 60-story building, and the only reason it stopped there was because the rock shelf caught her. Without it, the Lhotse face doesn't end for another 2,000 feet. Sonam Rinjing needed surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments that never fully healed. He couldn't go back to high-altitude guiding. He ended up doing trekking work in the lower Khumbu at about half the pay, supporting a wife, 2 kids, aging parents, and a younger brother still in school. Half the income, because a woman from Miami couldn't sit still for 10 days. I don't know how you process that math. Real quick, if you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly invested in these stories. And that's exactly who this channel is for. A like or a subscribe tells the algorithm to keep pushing this kind of content. Alright, back to the mountain. It was May 14th, 2018. Everest's South Col at over 26,000 feet sat under clear skies, with temperatures below minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit and critically low oxygen. In these conditions, undernutrition and dehydration can quietly degrade function until movement itself becomes impossible. Philip Schaefer, 52, arrived on Everest as an orthopedic surgeon from Nashville, Tennessee, with a structured and methodical approach to preparation. He had completed marathons and Ironman triathlons. His training metrics met high standards, and his expedition plan followed established protocols. He treated the climb like a systems problem, with a clear understanding of how the body responds to altitude and risk. But like many disciplined, high-performing people, he still relied on how he felt, hunger, thirst, fatigue, to decide when to eat and drink. Over 31 days on the mountain, those signals had diminished. Altitude suppressed his appetite, while his body continued to burn energy at elevated rates. In the days leading up to May 14th, his food and fluid intake dropped well below recommended levels. He lost weight steadily and produced minimal urine, indicating dehydration. Despite this, he continued moving efficiently and did not report significant issues. He departed Camp 3 at 24,500 feet early that morning, carrying a standard load toward Camp 4 at the South Koliwi. Conditions were stable. Early progress was controlled, though slower than on previous rotations. By the time he crossed the yellow band at around 25,000 feet, his pace had declined noticeably. He reported feeling heavy but continued. At the base of the Geneva Spur, near 25,800 feet, he stopped and sat down fully, a deviation from standard rest practices at altitude. He consumed a small amount of food and water, the first intake since leaving camp. His Sherpa, Tenzin, monitored him, but observed no immediate critical signs. However, stopping like that near the top is never just a quick break. As the ascent continued, Philip's movement became increasingly labored. Each step required visible effort beyond what his fitness level would normally demand. His breathing rate increased, and he did not consume additional food or fluids. He reached the edge of the South Col with Camp 4, less than 1,000 feet away, and sat down, unable to continue when prompted. Tenzin returned and observed clear signs of physical decline, paleness, shivering, and reduced responsiveness. His oxygen system was functioning, and his saturation level, while low, remained within expected range for the altitude. A short time later, Philip attempted to stand, but could not generate enough force to lift himself. Severe undernutrition and dehydration over the previous 30 hours had left his body unable to sustain exertion in extreme altitude conditions. Shortly after, he lost consciousness. Tenzin lowered him to the ground and called for assistance. 2 nearby climbers and another Sherpa responded quickly. Philip had a weak, irregular pulse and shallow breathing. Emergency. Glucose was administered, and a carry system was assembled using available gear. Everyone just switches into do what they can, right now mode. The team started carrying him slowly across the South Col toward Camp 4, picking their way over uneven ground as the cold and exhaustion built with every step. Philip came for a few moments during the move, but he couldn't stand or form clear words. Each pause seemed to take more out of him, and his condition kept slipping as they went. Inside a tent at Camp 4, he was placed on supplemental oxygen and given warm fluids in an attempt to stabilize him. For a short period, there were signs of response, but he never fully regained consciousness in a sustained way. He died later that evening at Camp 4. The evacuation to Kathmandu the following day confirmed severe hypoglycemia, dehydration, and an underlying cardiac arrhythmia, likely triggered by prolonged electrolyte imbalance and sustained stress at extreme altitude. The expedition review identified prolonged undernutrition and dehydration as the primary causes. Despite his medical background and structured preparation, Philip had continued relying on hunger and thirst signals that were suppressed by altitude. Without consistent intake over time, his body's energy systems gradually failed beyond recovery. It was May 14, 2016. Camp 4 on the South Col sat at 26,000 feet under a high-pressure system that had held for 3 days, a rare and coveted summit window. Tents were packed across the flat, wind-scoured plateau, and most climbers were horizontal, rationing oxygen, conserving everything they had for the midnight push. The kind of stillness up there isn't peaceful. It's calculated. Everyone is saving something. In one tent, a camera was running. Emmerich Quill was 29. He ran an adventure and survival channel built entirely on staged content, faked bear encounters, scripted river rescues, a desert survival scenario that his audience ate up without question. The formula was simple. Manufacture the danger, film the reaction, post it. It worked. Everest was supposed to be the biggest production he'd ever pulled off. He arrived with 2 cameras, a detailed shot list, and a plan for what he wanted to film at every single camp on the mountain. He had climbed to just over 6,000 meters on Denali 2 years prior, which gave him enough credibility to get onto a commercial expedition as a paying client. What he hadn't told the expedition leader was just how much filming he intended to do up there. That omission ended up costing him everything. If there's one thing that separates Everest from every other climb on Earth, it's the oxygen situation. Above 26,000 feet, your body is running on borrowed time and borrowed air. Most climbers use supplemental oxygen from Camp 4 all the way through the summit push and back, a flow rate of around 2 to 4 liters per minute, rationed carefully across bottles that last roughly 6 to 8 hours each at low flow. The margin is tight. There's no room to waste it, no room to miscalculate, and absolutely no room to burn through it, doing something that has nothing to do with getting up and back, down alive. While every other climber at Camp 4 was resting and conserving, Emmerich was setting up a shot. He had a tent-mate act unconscious while he filmed a rescue sequence, dragging him across the col, performing mock CPR, the whole thing. The shoot ran for close to 90 minutes. He was on oxygen the entire time and putting out real physical effort at 26,000 feet, which burns through a supply faster than just sitting still. He didn't track how much he was using. Who does that? Who burns through oxygen at 26,000 feet to film a fake rescue and just doesn't keep count? When he checked his bottles before the midnight departure, his regulator gauge was stiff from the cold, and he misread it, believing he had more than he did. He left with a group at 11:40 p.m. Nobody knew what he had already used. He moved well through the lower section of the push. Nothing about his pace raised any flags early on. By the balcony at 27,600 feet, he switched to his second bottle. It ran out faster than expected. At around 28,200 feet, just below the south summit, he signaled to his Sherpa that his oxygen had stopped. The bottle was empty. A spare wasn't available. The expedition's cache had already been allocated to another climber who had experienced a regulator failure lower on the route. Without supplemental oxygen above 28,000 feet, the body deteriorates fast. Not gradually, fast. Emmerich sat down. Within 20 minutes, he was unresponsive to verbal commands. His Sherpa attempted to move him, but he was fully dead weight within 30 minutes of oxygen loss. A second Sherpa reached them shortly after. Emmerich had no pulse. Base camp was notified immediately. No viable rescue option existed at that altitude and time. The 2 Sherpas began a careful descent without the body. Recovery wasn't possible in the immediate term. Here's what gets me about this one. Emmerich didn't die because of a storm or a fall or bad luck. He died in a sequence he personally built, piece by piece, hours before he ever left for the summit. The staged rescue scene, the oxygen he burned without tracking, the gauge he misread in the cold. Pull any one of those out and maybe he makes it back. Together they didn't leave him a chance. His body was recovered later that season and moved off the main route. His camera was found in his jacket. Footage on it included the full staged rescue sequence filmed at Camp 4, time-stamped the evening before his death. Oxygen consumption was reconstructed from bottle weights recovered at the scene, confirming he had used roughly 40% more than planned before the push even began. The cause of death was listed as anoxia secondary to oxygen supply depletion at extreme altitude. The expedition's incident report noted non-essential physical exertion and untracked oxygen consumption at Camp 4 as the primary contributing factors. No foul play, no equipment failure. Just a man who treated the death zone like a film set and ran out of time to figure out the difference. It was May 23, 2018, above the balcony on Mount Everest at roughly 27,500 feet. The route was quiet in the early hours, the wind steady and dry, the sky clear enough to suggest safety. Climbers moved deliberately along the fixed line, aware that small inefficiencies at this height compound quickly. Nothing looked wrong. The failure was already underway. Daniel Moore was 45, an IT contractor from Manchester who spent most of the year traveling between short-term projects. He was disciplined, methodical, and physically fit, a runner who tracked metrics obsessively at sea level. On the mountain, he trusted routine and self-control. His expedition was self-funded, with no sponsors, and he took pride in not needing special treatment or extra support. Daniel prepared thoroughly in some areas and neglected others. He trained in cardiovascular endurance extensively, but underestimated cold weather hydration. He carried melted snow in a thin plastic bottle, tucked into his pack, uninsulated and exposed. At altitude, fluid intake is critical to maintain blood volume and oxygen delivery. Frozen water removes that margin quietly, without pain or immediate warning. During the ascent toward the balcony, wind chill dropped temperatures well below zero. The bottle froze solid within hours. Daniel stopped drinking long before the summit push, assuming he could push through mild thirst. Dehydration thickened his blood, worsening hypoxia and slowing his brain. His pace fell slightly. His movements grew less precise. No alarm sounded. Above the balcony, the slope steepened and the air thinned further. Daniel's breathing felt labored, each step heavier than the last. His oxygen mask felt restrictive. Judgment dulled by hypoxia and dehydration led him to misinterpret the sensation. He believed he was not getting air. He reached up and removed the mask. Without supplemental oxygen, his saturation dropped rapidly. He staggered, missing a step beside the fixed line, and fell forward into drifted snow. His face struck first. He did not attempt to arrest himself. The collapse was sudden and complete. Daniel lay prone, unconscious within seconds. Snow packed around his mouth and nose as wind drifted loose powder over his face. With no mask and no movement, his airway became obstructed. There was no visible struggle. Climbers behind him noticed him, only after he failed to move. A climber called out and radioed for help immediately. Others reached him within minutes, but could not safely reposition him without risking themselves. At that altitude, intervention options were limited. Oxygen was reapplied, but there was no response. He remained motionless as the wind continued to blow snow across his face. Rescue personnel were notified, but response time at that location exceeded an hour. By the time a team could safely approach, Daniel had been unresponsive for too long. He was pronounced dead on the route, secured to prevent further movement. The post-mortem examination later identified hypoxic collapse followed by asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. Snow and ice were found compacted in the nasal passages and mouth. Facial abrasions were consistent with a forward fall. There was no evidence of defensive movement after the collapse. No equipment malfunction was identified. His oxygen system was functional, and his mask showed no defects. The smartwatch recovered from his wrist recorded steady movement, followed by an abrupt stop. After the expedition, Daniel's family shared his smartwatch data with investigators. The hydration log showed fluid intake ceasing hours before the incident. The graph circulated quietly on UK climbing forums, posted without commentary. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was an empty thermos. It was May 21st, 2013. Everest's summit ridge, above 28,000 feet, began clear and stable. Within hours, a fast-moving cloud system reduced visibility to near zero, making the ridge and a 10,000-foot drop indistinguishable. Claire Hadfield, 36, arrived on Everest as an inexperienced climber from Bozeman, Montana. She didn't have any real mountaineering background and had no history of technical alpine climbing before signing up. Her decision to join Everest came more from curiosity and confidence in general fitness than from any step-by-step progression in the mountains. From the start of the summit push, her movement looked steady at first. She climbed through the night from Camp 4 toward the upper mountain with her Sherpa guide, Ang Rita. Progress was smooth early on, and nothing immediately suggested serious issues. She reached the higher sections of the route and continued upward under stable conditions before beginning her descent later that morning. At that point, everything still looked manageable. She had enough oxygen, strong physical condition, and clear visibility. There was no reason to rush. On a normal day, she would have already been well below the south summit before any weather could close in. A delay occurred at the Hillary step during descent. Another client required extended assistance, and the group was held in place for over 30 minutes. Claire, already below the step, continued ahead at her own pace. The delay did not immediately present as significant, but altered the timing of her position on the ridge. By late morning, weather conditions began to change rapidly. Cloud cover moved in across the ridge, and visibility dropped from clear to severely limited within minutes. Wind speeds increased, driving snow across the surface and removing all visual contrast from the terrain. Visibility dropped to under 50 feet, with intermittent whiteout conditions reducing it even further. Claire was on the south summit ridge, clipped to the fixed rope. The ridge, normally defined by clear edges and drop-offs, appeared as a continuous, uniform surface. Landmarks used during ascent were no longer visible. She stopped moving. Her guide was behind her, but communication was disrupted by wind. With no visual reference and limited auditory cues, every direction appeared identical. The distinction between the safe path and the edge of the ridge could not be determined visually. After several minutes of standing there in fading visibility, she moved sideways off the fixed rope, trying to pick up the line of descent by feel and memory. The surface she stepped onto was a cornice, an overhanging formation of wind-packed snow extending beyond the actual ridge. In clear conditions, its shape would have been identifiable. In a whiteout, it appeared indistinguishable from solid ground. The cornice failed under her weight. It fractured behind her position, and she dropped through the break. Her safety tether, still clipped to the fixed rope, arrested the fall. She was left suspended several feet below the ridge, over the Kangshung face, as the broken snow collapsed beneath her. Her guide reached her within minutes. With assistance from another Sherpa, they secured the rope system and pulled her back onto the ridge. The extraction took over 20 minutes due to the terrain and conditions. That's the kind of moment where everything feels slow, even when people are moving fast. Claire sustained a deep laceration to her forearm and impact injuries from the harness arrest, and was initially conscious and responsive. She was guided down the mountain under continued low visibility conditions toward lower camps, where her condition began to deteriorate during the descent. She was evacuated from base camp 2 days later. Medical teams documented severe soft tissue trauma, internal complications consistent with high-altitude injury stress, and worsening systemic fatigue. Despite treatment efforts, her condition declined. Claire passed away shortly after evacuation. The expedition review identified the delay at the Hillary step as the key factor placing her on the ridge during the weather shift. The step onto the cornice was attributed to disorientation in whiteout conditions, where visual cues were completely removed. It was April 22nd, 2018, and the trail above La Bouche wound through terrain dotted with memorial cairns, stone pyramids for climbers who never came back. The air at 16,000 feet made conversation tough on the uphills, and the afternoon clouds rolling up the valley brought a damp cold that got into your clothing and stayed. Paige Dunnigan was 52, a petroleum executive from Houston, and she moved slowly at the back of her group. Tall and solid, she carried herself like someone used to. Authority, but altitude was stripping that away. Her breathing ran heavier than the other clients. Her Her rest stops came more often, and her complexion had a grayish tone that her climbing Sherpa picked up on before anyone else. Furba Concha was 29 with 4 summits, young for that number. He'd grown up in Rolwaling and finished a high-altitude medicine program run by a climbing NGO. The training taught him to read signs that most Sherpas picked up through instinct rather than clinical knowledge. He watched Paige closely from day one. Paige's medical clearance was forged. 2 years earlier, she'd had angioplasty. She was on daily cardiac medication. She had paid a cardiologist in Houston to sign a letter certifying her fit for extreme altitude with no issues. Furba noticed the pills first. Every morning, taken in secret from unmarked bottles. On the first rotation, Paige's oxygen saturation dropped lower and bounced back slower than it should have. Her lips went bluish at 19,500 feet. On the second rotation to Camp 2, Furba picked up an irregular pulse, racing, then pausing, then racing again. He reported it. Paige pulled out the cardiologist's letter. The expedition doctor went with the paperwork. Paige found out Furba had raised concerns. She told Furba, right there in front of other Sherpas, that if Furba's interference cost her the summit, she'd make sure Furba never worked for the company again. Paige had connections to the expedition's investors. That kind of threat carried real weight in a community where seasonal work decided whether families got through the winter. This part is hard for me to talk about calmly because the power dynamics are so ugly. A 29-year-old Sherpa catches a legitimate medical red flag, reports it like he's trained to, and gets threatened with career destruction by the patient. And the system lets it happen because Paige has paperwork and connections. Furba stopped filing formal reports. He didn't stop watching. During the third rotation, he saw Paige palming white tablets under her tongue, nitroglycerin for acute cardiac relief. Summit push, May 20th. Paige got to Camp 4, gray-faced, breathing hard even on supplemental oxygen. They left at midnight. She climbed slowly but steadily, reaching the balcony at 27,600 feet, nearly an hour behind the group. Above that, her pace fell off even more. Each step took visible seconds of effort. At around 28,100 feet, Paige pressed her hand to her chest. She doubled over her ice axe. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She collapsed onto the fixed rope. The cardiac condition her forged documents had hidden finally met the altitude, cold and exertion it needed. Furba went through Paige's pack looking for emergency meds and found everything the clearance letter denied: beta blockers, nitroglycerin, aspirin, a pulse oximeter, a full cardiac pharmacy, 28,000 feet. She carried the evidence of her own lie the entire climb and still handed over that forged clearance. I genuinely don't know what to do with that level of denial. Furba attempted chest compressions at 28,000 feet in the dark on a steep slope. The altitude made it nearly impossible. He managed less than a minute before exhaustion, and the lack of any response made the outcome clear. Paige Dunnigan was 52. The investigation pulled Paige's full medical records. The physician in Houston lost his license. Furba Concha finished the season but never went back to high-altitude work. He told friends what happened at 28,000 feet changed something in him that didn't come back. I want to take a second here because I sometimes get asked why I keep making these videos. It's not about just being a source of income, and honestly, the answer changes depending on the week. Sometimes it's because the stories genuinely keep me up at night, and making the video is the only way I can get them out of my head. Other times it's because I read the comments and realize people actually learn from this stuff. But if I'm being really honest, the main reason is the Sherpas. Their side almost never gets told, and I think that matters more than any of us realize. It was May 23rd, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. The Hillary Step at 28,839 feet marked one of the final technical obstacles before the summit, where climbers queued on fixed ropes during busy weather windows. Heather Brooke was 33 years old, an accountant from San Francisco, California. She had planned this expedition as the culmination of years of training and saving. Her climbing fitness was good, and she had completed several high-altitude climbs on other mountains. She believed she could move efficiently through the summit push and handle the challenges of the death zone. Everest's summit push required climbers to navigate through the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body could not survive for extended periods. The Hillary Step was a near vertical rock face requiring climbers to ascend and descend using fixed ropes. Traffic jams at the step were common during peak season, causing dangerous delays. Climbers waiting in the death zone depleted oxygen supplies and energy reserves. Frostbite, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could occur rapidly during delays. The expedition leader briefed the team at Camp 4 before the summit push. He explained that if traffic was heavy at the Hillary Step, they might need to turn around to avoid dangerous delays. Heather listened but made a comment about not turning back after coming this far. Another climber mentioned that waiting in line at altitude could be fatal. Heather cut him off, saying she had been planning this for years and that she could handle the wait. She added that this was her only chance and she wasn't wasting it. The team left Camp 4 after midnight. Heather climbed steadily through the darkness, using supplemental oxygen and following the fixed ropes. Progress was slow in the extreme altitude. By mid-morning, they reached the Hillary Step. A long line of climbers from multiple expeditions was queued on the ropes. The guide estimated a significant wait. The guide gathered the team and recommended they turn around due to the delay. Heather refused. She said she had come too far to turn back now. The guide explained that waiting would deplete their oxygen and energy, making the descent dangerous. Heather argued that she had enough oxygen and could manage. Other team members agreed to descend, but Heather insisted on staying. The guide reluctantly agreed to wait with her, but emphasized they would need to move quickly once through. Heather waited in line at the Hillary Step for an extended period. The temperature was well below zero. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, barely moving. Her oxygen supply was depleting steadily. Her extremities were becoming numb despite insulated gear. Finally, she reached the base of the step and began ascending the near vertical section. She summited after the extended delay. She spent several minutes on top, taking photos despite the guides urging to descend immediately. By the time they began descending, her oxygen supply was running low. She changed to her reserve cylinder. The descent back to the Hillary Step took longer than expected. Heather's movements had slowed noticeably. When they reached the step, another queue had formed for the descent. Climbers were backed up, waiting to descend the fixed ropes. The guide's concern was evident. Heather's oxygen ran out while waiting. She began using the guide's emergency supply. Her coordination deteriorated rapidly without adequate oxygen. When her turn came to descend the step, her movements were clumsy and slow. Partway down the vertical section, she lost her footing. Her weight came onto the fixed rope and safety system. She hung suspended, unable to regain her footing on the near vertical surface. The guide above tried to assist but couldn't reach her position safely. Other climbers helped lower her the rest of the way down the step. She was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The guide and other climbers attempted to move her downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She collapsed on the route below the Hillary Step. Despite efforts to revive her and administer oxygen from other climbers' supplies, she did not regain consciousness. She died on the route in the death zone. Her body remained on the mountain. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypoxia and exhaustion in the death zone. The extended delay at the Hillary Step had depleted her oxygen supply and energy reserves. The lack of supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude had caused rapid deterioration of brain and organ function. Contributing factors included the decision to wait in the queue, despite warnings and extended time in the death zone without adequate oxygen. The death was ruled accidental.